see that video? I mean, it's bananas.
I'll tell you why this is particularly close to my heart, because to coin a favourite phrase of the left wing, it has been my lived experience over the past 3 years or so that a lot of crimes happening against women especially seem to be committed by people who aren't from this country. I've been followed home with a man in one of those Afghan kolpol hats chuntering away in some language all the way to my front door. I had to hide in my neighbour's house and pretend I didn't live in my house because he was lurking around outside trying to do indecent things to himself. That's right. I've also had my phone robbed off me by a Roma woman with a scarf on. And I'm like, what are we doing here? Who are these people? Why are we importing all this stuff? I cannot walk down the streets where I live anymore without weird men leering at me, making comments. Look, I'm not one of these Me Too movement women. When it was builders wolf whistling from vans, I don't care. Sometimes it brightens up your day. Because what they don't do is they don't get into your personal space. They don't trail you. They don't physically approach you. They don't follow you to your front door. It's a very different sort of more harmless thing, a wolf whistle, than some of the stuff I'm being subjected to now. And some of the stuff my best mate who lives around the corner, again, her lived experience. Also, guess what? A woman with long blonde hair. She has 4 teenage daughters. All of them now have at some point been sexually assaulted. They've been groped. They have been followed. They are scared living in London. What is going on? So I am going to keep talking about this. I don't care if people turn around and goes, you're a racist, because my safety and the safety of women in this country is paramount. That is way more important than offending certain communities who, quite frankly, have men with medieval values when it comes to women, and I ain't standing for it.
Is there any way back for Sir Keir Starmer, or is he a dead PM walking?
I think the only thing that Keir Starmer can look forward to, really, Martin, is that look behind himself, actually, is his own backbenchers and possibly his frontbenchers. I can't see anybody replacing him, to be honest. At one time there was muted about Angela Rayner replacing him. She's sort of gone missing. West Streeting is sort of slithering about in the background. He could be ready to launch the old dagger in the back, but I'm surprised. He said he had a popularity rating of 11%. I'm surprised it's as high as that at the moment, Martin, because everywhere you go in this country, as a politician, people talk to me wherever I go, and this man is despised. I think he's the most despised Prime Minister in history. I think he's cowardly. He U-turns on everything. He bends to his backbenchers all the time just to save his own skin. He's a dead man walking. I think his time is probably up after the May elections this year, but I dread to think.
The unthinkable has happened. Britain's Prime Minister, the man who promised stability and unity, is now facing the fight of his political life. Parliament is in chaos. The streets are erupting. And whispers of removal are no longer just whispers. They're becoming reality. What you're about to discover will shock you to your core. This isn't just another political scandal. This is the unravelling of a government, the collapse of public trust, and potentially the end of Keir Starmer's time in number 10. Stay with me, because what's happening right now in Westminster will change the course of British history forever. The establishment is crumbling and nobody saw it coming this fast. Let me take you back to where this all began, because what's happening right now didn't start today or yesterday. It started the moment Keir Starmer walked through the doors of 10 Downing Street, making promises he couldn't keep and creating expectations he had no intention of meeting. The British people voted for change, they voted for honesty, they voted for a government that would put them first after years of chaos and corruption. What they got was something entirely different from day one. The cracks were already showing. The policies that were supposed to help working families ended up crushing them. The promises of transparency turned into secrecy and cover-ups. And the unity he spoke about became division on a scale this country hasn't seen in decades. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the mainstream media was busy praising Starmer's every move and painting him as the saviour of British politics, something was happening beneath the surface. The people weren't buying it. They could see through the polished speeches and the carefully crafted image. They could feel it in their wallets when their bills kept rising. They could see it in their communities when the promised changes never materialised. They could sense it in their gut that something was very, very wrong. And when people start losing faith in their leader, when they start questioning everything they were told, that's when the real danger begins for any government. The first major blow came when leaked documents revealed what many had suspected all along. The government wasn't being honest about their plans. Internal communications showed a completely different agenda than what was being presented to the public. We're talking about policies that would directly harm the very people who voted Labour into power. We're talking about backroom deals with special interests. We're talking about a level of deception that would make even the most cynical politician blush. When these documents hit the press, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal. And the British people don't forget betrayal easily. Social media exploded. News outlets couldn't ignore it anymore. And suddenly, the carefully constructed image of Keir Starmer as the honest, straightforward leader began to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. But Starmer's team thought they could weather the storm. They thought they could spin their way out of it, issue some carefully worded apologies, maybe throw a junior minister under the bus and move on like nothing happened. That's the establishment playbook, right? Deny, deflect, and wait for the news cycle to move on to something else. Except this time, something different happened. The people weren't moving on. The anger wasn't subsiding. If anything, it was growing stronger with each passing day. Protests started small, just a few hundred people outside Parliament. Then it was thousands, then tens of thousands. These weren't your typical political demonstrations with pre-printed signs and organised chants. These were ordinary British citizens who had simply had enough. Teachers, nurses, shop workers, pensioners, young people who couldn't afford to buy homes, families struggling to put food on the table. They all came together with one unified message: we were lied to and we want accountability. Inside Parliament, things were getting even more chaotic. Members of Starmer's own party started breaking ranks. At first, it was just whispered conversations in the corridors, quiet expressions of concern in private meetings. But as the pressure mounted from their constituents back home, Labour MPs found themselves in an impossible position: support their leader and face the wrath of the voters, or speak out and risk being labelled as traitors to the party. More and more chose to speak out. Backbenchers who had been silent for months suddenly found their voices. They started asking difficult questions during Prime Minister's questions. They started demanding answers about the leaked documents, about the broken promises, about the direction the government was taking. And each time they did, Starmer's responses became more defensive, more evasive, more desperate. The opposition saw blood in the water and they weren't about to let this opportunity pass. The Conservatives, still reeling from their own election defeat, suddenly found new energy. They filed motion after motion, demanded inquiry after inquiry, and kept the pressure relentlessly focused on Starmer's credibility. The Liberal Democrats, the SNP, even smaller parties all piled on. What had been a divided opposition suddenly became a unified force with a single target. Parliamentary sessions turned into brutal interrogations. Every statement Starmer made was fact-checked in real time. Every promise was compared against reality. Every deflection was called out immediately. The man who had built his reputation as a skilled lawyer and debater found himself constantly on the back foot, unable to control the narrative anymore. Then came the moment that changed everything. A senior cabinet minister, someone who had been with Starmer from the beginning, someone who was considered absolutely loyal, held a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, cameras everywhere, and you could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew something big was about to happen, but nobody could have predicted just how explosive it would be. This minister, standing at that podium with visible emotion, did something almost unheard of in British politics. They told the truth. Not the sanitised, focus grouped version of the truth, the real uncomfortable, damaging truth about what was happening behind closed doors at Number 10. They revealed meetings where concerns about policy impacts on ordinary people were dismissed. They exposed the toxic culture of secrecy and control. They confirmed that yes, the public was being misled, and yes, many in government knew it and stayed silent anyway. The immediate aftermath was pandemonium. News channels went into 24/7 coverage. Social media crashed from the sheer volume of people sharing and discussing what had just happened. Opposition leaders demanded Starmer's immediate resignation. Even some Labour MPs publicly called for him to step down. The protests outside Parliament grew larger and louder. But here's what made this moment truly unprecedented. This wasn't just about one scandal or one policy failure anymore. This was about a complete and total loss of trust. When a senior member of your own cabinet turns against you publicly, it sends a message that cannot be ignored. It says that things are so bad inside government that staying silent is no longer an option. It says that loyalty to the truth is more important than loyalty to the party or the leader. Starmer went into emergency meetings with his closest advisors. The doors of number 10 were closed, but sources inside painted a picture of panic and desperation. Options were being discussed. Could they ride this out? Could they reshuffle the cabinet and remove the dissenters? Could they call a snap election and reset everything? But every option seemed worse than the last. Riding it out meant months of political paralysis while the country suffered. Removing dissenters would only prove the accusations of authoritarian control, and calling an election when your approval ratings are in freefall is political suicide. The trap was closing and there seemed to be no way out. Behind the scenes, something even more significant was taking place. Senior members of the Labour Party, people who had dedicated their entire lives to the movement, were having conversations that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. These weren't radicals or troublemakers. These were establishment figures, former ministers, respected backbenchers, party grandees who had seen governments rise and fall over decades. And they were all coming to the same conclusion. Starmer had become a liability that the party could no longer afford. Private meetings were held in discreet locations away from the prying eyes of the media. WhatsApp groups buzzed with activity as MPs coordinated their next moves. The discussion wasn't about whether Starmer should go anymore. It was about how and when. The constitutional mechanisms for removing a sitting Prime Minister are complicated, but they exist. Within the Labour Party, there are procedures for challenging leadership, but those take time, require votes, follow specific rules. And time was something nobody felt they had. The country was in crisis. Public confidence was at rock bottom. Every day Starmer remained in office, the damage to the party's future prospects grew worse. Some MPs started floating the idea of a delegation going to number 10 to tell Starmer directly that he no longer had the confidence of his parliamentary party. It's a brutal moment in any politician's career, but it's happened before in British history. Prime Ministers have been forced out by their own party when they became electoral poison. The question was whether enough MPs had the courage to do it. The pressure was coming from every direction now. Trade unions, traditionally the backbone of Labour support, were issuing statements expressing deep concern about the government's direction. Some were even threatening to withdraw funding and support. Constituency parties across the country were passing motions of no confidence in the leadership. These are the grassroots members, the people who knock on doors during elections, who organise events, who keep the party machine running. When they turn against you, you've lost your foundation. Business leaders who had been cautiously optimistic about a Labour government were now publicly criticising the chaos and uncertainty. International allies were watching nervously, wondering if Britain was about to descend into another period of political instability that would make it an unreliable partner on the world stage. The media analysis became increasingly brutal. Political commentators who had given Starmer the benefit of the doubt were now writing scathing columns about his leadership failures. Television panels that once defended him were now picking apart every decision he'd made since taking office. Even journalists who were traditionally Labour-friendly couldn't ignore the magnitude of what was happening. Opinion polls released during this period told a devastating story. Starmer's personal approval ratings had collapsed to levels lower than any Prime Minister in modern history at this stage of their tenure. The Labour Party's polling numbers were in free fall. In key constituencies that Labour had won just months earlier, voters were saying in overwhelming numbers that they regretted their choice and would vote differently if an election were held today. What made this crisis different from previous political scandals was the speed at which everything was unravelling. Usually these things play out over months or even years. There are inquiries, investigations, slow erosions of support. But this was happening in real time, compressed into weeks of non-stop chaos. Social media meant that every development, every leaked conversation, every protest, every resignation was instantly amplified to millions of people. There was no time for damage control teams to get ahead of the story. There was no cooling off period where public attention might drift elsewhere. The news cycle had become a relentless wave that just kept crashing down on Starmer and his government without pause.